I wanted to start off with what is happening out in Iran, because, one day we wake up and all of a sudden Trump, his administration, they took out Qasem Soleimani and the world was shocked. I mean, everyone didn't know what was going on. The mainstream media was in the dark. We had Nancy Pelosi and the rest. They were all complaining they knew nothing about it. There were no leaks. Now, from that point, why do you think that Trump went ahead, and not just him, his administration went ahead and decided that this is the right time to take out Soleimani?
Well, I think this is an extremely complicated situation. And most people, including the Democrats who are commenting on it, don't have a clue. I mean, to me, one of the most interesting things is to watch the Democrats who were opposing Trump's withdrawal of troops from Syria, were up in arms over that, now accusing Trump of being a warmonger. So, certainly he's overturned the apple cart. Now, my personal view is that I think there was an element of this which was a potential setup of Trump. And the reason I say that is if you look at the crowd around him that's been most intent on a war with Iran, it's the Bolton crowd, it's the Pompeo types and others. Trump himself has been clear that he doesn't want a war with Iran, he doesn't want regime change, but he's not going to tolerate the old Obama nuclear treaty. And so there's a lot of evidence that there's been some back channel discussions into Iran about moving beyond the stalemate. Now, at the same time, you have a lot of bad actors, including Soleimani, who in some ways he's a very interesting character in the sense that the argument that he has American blood on his hands is absolutely true. He was providing the IEDs that were maiming and killing Americans in Iraq. But then you have to remember, why were we in Iraq? What was the Iraq War about? And I think what we have to do in order to fully understand what's going on is look at the context of the last 20 years. What is the deep state's policy toward the Middle East? And this is where I was concerned, and still am a little concerned, that Trump got into a bit of a detour. Because if you look at what he was doing in September, October, November, December, he was moving to resolve the problems in Syria, crush ISIS, work with the Russians, the Turks, give the Syrians back sovereignty over their territory. He was talking about pulling troops out of Afghanistan, and was also at the same time getting the deal with China, the trade deal, and working with Putin on a number of issues, including Ukraine. So here you have Trump under enormous continued attack by a bunch of rabid, insane Democrats who are trying to impeach him, totally transforming the strategic posture of the United States. And that's why I was concerned that it appears as though he was pulled into a potential for another war. Now, that being said, it's very interesting what the Iran retaliation was. Now, assuming that that's the end of what they're going to do for retaliation, they took a plan from the Trump playbook. Hit a couple hangars, empty hangars in the desert, and tell the people that you're going to shoot at them in advance so they can evacuate the premises. That's what Trump did when he hit Syria after the fake Duma chemical weapons story. So maybe we can move beyond a potential war with Iran, but it's going to require a real continued commitment to peace on Trump's part and bringing in other countries like Russia and China to work with him to ensure that Iran can be kept in line, which is not an easy thing to do.
Well, I think that Trump, when he realized that Iran was continually keeping the nuke deal with Obama and Kerry, because Kerry visited Iran multiple times, which is a violation of the Logan Act. Actually, Trump actually came out and said John Kerry should be arrested for violating the Logan Act. And Iran kept on looking at the EU to, uphold their part of the nuke deal, while the United States dropped it. And during this whole time, Trump placed sanctions on Iran, hurt the economy of Iran and people inside of Iran. There have been protests, and it seems that Soleimani shut down the protests within Iran. People started to get upset with the leadership. Now, you mentioned that Iran fired missiles into Iraq but didn't hit anything. I mean, if I was going to do something and I wanted to strike back at someone who killed my top terrorists, I wouldn't hit an empty base. You know what I'm saying? If I was,
sure.
Why hit an empty base and then come back and fire more missiles to show that you really mean it? If you're going to really do something, you do it on the first shot.
Well, that's what I mean, Dave, by making the analogy to what Trump did in Syria after Duma, because Trump was under enormous pressure then from the international community to go after Assad and also Russia. And so he thought he had to do something, but he did something that was symbolic. And it appears more than anything else that what the Iranians did was symbolic, so they could say to their people, see, we're not going to put up with this treatment, while not provoking the United States into tit-for-tat escalation. Now, all of this is contingent on a very questionable process. And, you know, I've been looking at people like Lawrence Wilkerson, Scott Ritter, Larry Johnson, a former CIA intelligence official, who have raised the question of, are we going to be dependent forever on these intelligence briefings where we're told there's indisputable evidence, as we were with the Iraqi war, weapons of mass destruction, as we were told about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and so on. And the irony here is that the same deep state networks now advising Trump on Iran are the ones who are going after him, the Brennan networks in the CIA. So that's why I'm very suspicious of the intelligence. The question, though, and this is why, you know, you can't treat this thing like World Wrestling Federation where you try and find the guy with the white hat and cheer for him. You have to look at the deeper picture. And on this, that's why I brought up the China question. Trump is working with the Chinese on a number of levels. He's working with Putin on a number of things, including Ukraine. He's working with Erdogan. You know, he's working with López Obrador in Mexico. He's transforming international relations in a way that is undermining what people call the deep state in the most profound way. And they're going to do whatever they can do to try to disrupt him and stop him. The Mueller report didn't work. This Ukraine Gate situation and the endless impeachment that Pelosi's trying to rig, that's not going to work. I think they were hoping they could get him trapped into a new war. But I think Trump is too smart for that. And that's why what Mrs. LaRouche, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, has proposed is the way to get out of any kind of problem is to have an emergency summit with Putin and with Xi Jinping and immediately talk about two things. One is security guarantees for Iran, provided they sign a new nuclear agreement, which is a real nuclear agreement, not the Obama nonsense, but a real one, and have the Russians enforce that. Now, at the same time, the people may not know there was a major deal signed between Iraq and China a couple months ago for the Iraqis providing $20 to $30 billion worth of oil to China, in return for which China would come into Iraq and start rebuilding infrastructure and industry. This is the way you get peace. You have real reconstruction, not funded by the American taxpayers who give money to these consultants and globalist corporations who steal the money and don't build anything, but you actually put it into the economy in a way that will have an effect. And I think Trump is very supportive of working with the Chinese on this, especially because the Chinese are saying they'll bring the United States in as a third partner in some of these projects. So there is a way out. And at the same time, of course, you've got to prosecute the deep state for Russiagate. You've got to have the Barr and Durham report come out and put some people away. So we're in an extremely fast-moving, interesting situation. And, you know, I would just urge people not to jump to conclusions too quickly without looking at the broader context.
Now, you said that we have to move forward by putting people behind bars, and I think that is ongoing right now. And I think this is why certain players tried to start a war, because everything that they've done is about to be exposed.
Exactly.
All their even with Iran, with the pallets of cash that Obama sent, that he sent to Iran. I mean, all of it, the Uranium One deal, all of it's about to be exposed. And I think that the deep state players, the ones that are being investigated, they're trying to figure out a way to get out of this. And I think Trump called them on it. I don't think they ever expected him to hit Soleimani like he did. We know there was a protest going on in Iran. We know it was driven by Iranians. It wasn't a grassroots Iraqi protest. The handlers were out on the outside. There's pictures of them being there. Soleimani was in Iraq at the time. And it seems that they were trying to push something with the protests in Iraq and hopefully get something started. And it seems that Trump shut it down and countered them, just like he did with the Ukrainian phone call where they had the whistleblower and he produced his phone transcript. It seems to me he did the same thing in Iran, where he countered everything that they were trying to do and showed Iran, this is not, the administrations of the past. This is a new administration, and I don't bow to you, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do right now. Then it's your move.
I think it's important in his discussion today that he did say that he does not want regime change. He does not want war, but he wants what's necessary to serve the interests of the people of Iran. Now, he then talked about bringing in the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans, some of the Arab countries. If you think about it, the protests in Iraq are not isolated. You have the Lebanese government fell. You have tremendous protests there. All over South America, you have protests because the financial system's collapsing. Countries are being destroyed by the financial networks that are tied to these military-industrial complex. And, their policy is use war to deal with the protests and also with to make money. And I think that Trump is well aware of this, the fact that he's been talking more recently about the military-industrial complex. In terms of the Middle East, this is really crucial because Eisenhower's use of this term initially, military-industrial complex, came out of some lessons that were very hard for him with the figuring out what happened in Iran, where the British and the Dulles networks and the Harriman networks pulled off a coup to get rid of an elected government there. And then again in the Suez Crisis in 1956, where the British, the French, and the Israelis invaded Egypt, and they wanted Eisenhower to support them. And Eisenhower said to the British, you get the hell out, or we're going to impose sanctions on you. And he had a firsthand view of the corruption of these networks, and he was passing that on to John Kennedy. And of course, I think Kennedy paid for these lessons with his life. Now, here we have Trump, out of nowhere seemingly, standing up against these networks, and they see him as an existential threat. I think if we've learned anything, Dave, over the last 3 years, it's that people like John Brennan, Obama, the mainstream media are really paid prostitutes who are out working for these globalists and billionaires trying to destroy Trump because of the threat he represents to their system. And so the fact that he stood up against it and fought it is the reason we have an opportunity now to win this fight. That doesn't mean that he always makes the right decision, especially since beyond the players that we know, like the Brennans and the Clappers, there are people who came forward recently that we'd never heard of before, like Taylor and Kent and Fiona Hill. You've got such a deep bench of these administrators and these bureaucrats who are inside the institutions who represent the stormtroopers, so to speak, for these globalists. And Trump has to fight them off every single day. They're the ones who produce the phony intelligence reports. They're the ones who then turn on Trump when, for example, they went with this whole Ukraine story. But I think the important thing is that the American people are harder to fool right now than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago because of programs like yours, because of the better ones of the alternative media who are digging for the truth. And I think there are people who recognize that Trump is fighting for their interess. And what's important now is for them to understand who the enemy is and what the enemy's game plan is. And I think hopefully that will become more clear as Barr and Durham move toward concluding their investigation.
Yeah, I think it will become more clear because every day people are watching the mainstream media, if they still watch it, and they're watching how they continually manipulate the news and how many people now are using the term fake news and they're calling them out on. I mean, when you watched the whole thing with Iran, you had MSNBC out there reporting that, 30 U.S. soldiers died in the explosions from the missile launch from Iran, which was completely false.
That was Iranian propaganda.
Yeah. It seems like the mainstream media is helping the Iranian propaganda, not reporting the facts and the news for America.
But that's not surprising when you realize that the mainstream media is run by the same corporate global networks that run the defense establishment, the oil companies, the banks, and so on. I think what's interesting is that because of the media's attempt to discredit truth seekers, that they've actually gotten people to understand that when you're called a conspiracy theorist, that's an attempt to discredit you by people who actually are the conspiracy theorists. I found from talking to, many, many people over the last year that people no longer react when they're told, oh, that's conspiracy theory. They say, no, it's actually truth, because people are investigating. They are digging. We're also helped, Dave, by the fact that they can't finalize or they can't solve the economic problem. They're kicking it down the road. They're printing more and more funny money, helicopter money, quantitative easing to infinity, and telling us that everything's fine. Well, if you have a lot of stock, you're sitting pretty right now. Don't count on that for your retirement. This whole system is set to blow. And I think the important thing for Trump is to deal with these British operatives, the so-called deep state or military-industrial complex operatives in the government now, so that in his second term, he can do an economic reset, which includes taking down the private central banks and restoring an American national credit system. That's what I think the benefit of working with someone like, the benefit of working for peace is that we never had a peace dividend that we were supposed to have after the collapse of the Cold War because the military-industrial complex stayed in power. Trump's idea is that we're not going to keep spending $700 billion to $1 trillion a year for war. We're going to take that money and put it into real economy. And so I think we're coming to a moment of truth in the post-World War II period where things can't continue as they have. And, I commend you for the work you do because you've obviously reached a lot of.
Since you're mentioning the economy, I wanted to get your take on this because it seems that Trump, when he was talking about Iran, he always goes into the economic side of it. And he said something really, really interesting because you talked about, taking down the central bank and, restoring the economy back to the people. He said that the United States now is energy independent and we don't need the Middle East anymore, which opens up a lot of options. Now, we know the Middle East was set up by the central bank system to push the dollar out to other countries using the petrodollar, where they had to buy the oil that these countries produced. And this is how they took us off the gold standard and put us on the petrodollar system. It seems like Trump is trying to break free of this by making the United States energy independent and saying we don't need the Middle East anymore. And he even said that this opens up a lot more options.
Well, I think also his opposition to the phony green agenda is part of the same thing, because the same people who have made the United States dependent on the global money flows from the petrodollar system are the ones now who are saying we're going to shut it all down and go to a green economy, which would finalize the deindustrialization of the United States. Now, Trump, as an economic realist, has to know that a stock market bubble is very different from increases in productivity and manufacturing, machine tool production, and so on. He knows it. And the American government is being held hostage by these central banks. And I include the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, but especially the Federal Reserve System. Now, if you're going to deal with the problem as a whole, you've got to look at where the alternatives would be. And it's not just energy independence for the United States. That's all well and good. But how do we revive our manufacturing sector? And that's where we have to make a break with the funny money, helicopter money system and the casino economy and move back toward a physical economic system based on production. And that requires a change in credit policy, which will not happen with the Federal Reserve. They've made it clear they're going to provide whatever it takes to keep these bankrupt banks and hedge funds and speculators in business, even if it means shutting down the last productive sector in the United States. So we've got to address that. And, I think it's going to be extremely interesting between now and the election, where you have the Democrats putting up a whole clown car of candidates, none of whom has a clue what to do with the economy. None of whom, it's so funny to see them scrambling to say they're anti-war now, when they've voted for every war policy and tried to stymie Trump at every step of the way when he's trying to get us out of these wars. So I think the attempt to defeat him with impeachment has failed. And that's why I'm very concerned that we not get into a war in Iran, but that we use the opportunity now to withdraw our troops from the region and work on a new security arrangement, which is based on the only thing that's really lasting for security, which is economic progress. And for that, we need other partners. And the best partner we would have for that right now is the Russians. The Russians put a lot into the fight against terrorism in Syria, and Putin showed that he's someone who could be relied on. I think if Trump is able to pull the United States out of our engagement in the Middle East, he'll show the rest of the world that he's not only serious about changes in military posture, but also in economic policy. I live here in Germany, and I see the German press making fun of Trump on the economy, when there's nothing more disastrous than what's happening here in Germany. A collapse of infrastructure, the collapse of the auto industry, wages collapsing, homelessness growing. It's becoming, and some of this is related to the refugee crisis, some of it's just related to bad economic policy from the European Union. So we have the opportunity to restore American leadership, not as a unipolar power, but through mutually beneficial trade agreements, military agreements, and so on. And that's what Trump has been about since he decided to run for president. And that's why he's so hated by the people who learned about the world from people like Henry Kissinger. You mentioned petrodollars. The first name that comes to mind is Kissinger, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, two of the most dastardly figures in the latter part of the 20th century.
No, I think you're right about Trump dealing with Putin. I think when the whole Russian collusion thing was going on, he was holding back where he wanted to speak to Putin, but he was holding back because they held the entire investigation that was going on. But on December 31st of 2019, he did tweet out that he spoke to Putin, and actually Putin called him to thank him about informing him about a terrorist attack in St. Petersburg. So they are having conversations, and I do believe that they're working with each other because Putin did fly to Syria while this whole Iran thing was going on. So I think they are coordinating this entire operation.
And Dave, Ukraine also, that with all the nonsense in the Congress on Ukraine, Trump is absolutely right to put the finger on Biden, not just because of his son making money from this corrupt company, but because Biden was the point man for the Obama administration in Ukraine, which included the coup in February 2014, which put an even more corrupt group of oligarchs in power. And we're doing that for the sake of confronting Russia. And what I'm sure Giuliani has some more information on this, but more importantly, Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine because the Ukrainian people were tired of corruption and war, the confrontation with Russia. And so now he's meeting with Putin. He's working with Putin with Trump's blessing. This is part of the Trump-Zelensky agreement and also the back channel that Trump has with Putin. So he's moving to resolve these unresolvable hotspots, these areas that are breeding grounds of possible World War III. And instead of getting credit for that, he's accused of trying to use the Ukraine situation for personal political gain, as if he needs something like that to beat Biden.
Well, I think what they're doing is they're projecting what they did in Ukraine onto him.
Yeah,
the corruption and everything else, because we spoke about this going back 2014, 2015 about the whole regime change in Ukraine. How did this all start? How did the war start in Ukraine? It was the same players that are now accusing Trump of doing what they did in Ukraine. And he had nothing to do with Ukraine.
It was the Clinton State Department, Victoria Nuland from the neoconservative movement, and George Soros. You had the same network that's involved in every regime change around the world. And then you find out this is the same network that's behind Russiagate, Ukrainegate. And so, the interesting thing is they made mistakes assuming Hillary would win. They did a lot of things that were illegal and corrupt and that really put them in a potentially damaging situation, but they thought Hillary would win. When she didn't win, it's not just that people were afraid they weren't going to get jobs or things of that sort. They were afraid they were going to go to jail. And that's still the case. And this is sort of a deferred justice for the American people. It's been deferred for 3 years because they tried to turn it on Trump. But, it's so ironic. They say Trump's trying to bring foreign interference into the U.S. elections. What the hell did the Clinton campaign do bringing in the Christopher Steele report? Is Christopher Steele an American? Is he from a friendly country? He was part of a British intelligence operation to destroy Trump. So, any way you look at it, there's so many ironies and so much hypocrisy. Or Pelosi saying, we have to rush this impeachment process because every day Trump stays in office is a danger to national security. Then they pass these phony articles of impeachment and she won't pass them on to the Senate. So she's prolonging what she says is the great danger to the country. You never read about this in the media, of course, but these are the kinds of signposts that show you how endangered these people feel and how they're trying to regroup and come up with some other operation to bring down Trump.
And it seems like they're running out of ammunition. They're running out of things to blame Trump on. I mean, if we go back to Nancy Pelosi with the articles of impeachment, there's no crime there. That's why she's not delivering it to the Senate. There's nothing there. And if they send it to the Senate, which they're going to have to do anyhow because Senator Hawley amended the rules in the Senate where if they don't receive the articles of impeachment within 25 days, they're going to go ahead with it anyhow. So she has until January 12th or something, because he warned her a couple weeks back. So she's running out of time. And what are they going to do? Come up with other articles of impeachment? I think what's happening here is every time they do these things and they push it out and the mainstream media pushes it out, I think more and more people are waking up saying, what is going on here? Why do we have hearings in a basement? Why? I mean, why aren't transcripts released? How come the president didn't get due process? If this can happen to him, I don't want a trial like this. I mean, they're exposing themselves to everything.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's very much like when the Peter Strzok, Lisa Page text messages were produced, and suddenly people saw that here were the FBI agents in charge of the Clinton email investigation and the Russia-Trump investigation, who were highly corrupt and, in spite of all the lies about this, had a real intention. And of course, you see that with Pelosi. Pelosi made these incredible comments recently when she was asked, well, why didn't you try to impeach George W. Bush for going to war based on lies? And she said, well, I didn't think that was impeachable. But for Trump to follow the congressional rules that were written into the Ukraine agreement, to do a vetting of Ukraine before you release the funds, to say that was somehow a corruption. I don't think people pay that much attention to the details, Dave, but I think there's a stench coming out of this thing that people do see, a desperation to overturn an election. And, for all the talk about the sanctity of the electoral process, the Democrats are showing absolute contempt for the voters. So how do they get away saying that they're trying to protect our electoral system? So I'm hopeful that we've seen the end of this potential tit-for-tat retaliation with Iran. I'm not confident that we are, but I'm hopeful. But in order to turn this into a positive pivot, I really think people should go to the LaRouchePAC.com website and read the resolution that was drafted, the emergency call from Helga Zepp LaRouche for a Trump-Putin-Xi summit to deal with this situation. Because you need to have the adults in the room doing it. You don't need State Department officials and intelligence officials. You need these heads of state who actually have a sense of representing the interests of a sovereign nation. And that's the way to get some progress, not just with Iran and the Middle East, but with the world.